The dust clouds kicked up by Rosie's hooves settled gently on the weathered planks of Clearwater's main street as Jake Thornton guided his beloved mare toward the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store. At 62, Jake moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose bones remembered every hard mile of 15 years riding the frontier, but his pale blue eyes still held the sharp awareness that had kept him alive through Apache raids and outlaw ambushes. His silver beard, streaked with the last traces of auburn from his younger days, caught the afternoon sun as he dismounted with practiced ease. Rosie snorted softly and nuzzled his shoulder, a gesture of affection that never failed to bring a rare smile to Jake's weathered face. The chestnut mare stood 16 hands high with a white blaze down her nose and 4 white socks that made her distinctive across 3 territories. Her coat gleamed with the kind of care that spoke of devotion rather than mere ownership. Jake ran his scarred hand along her neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath warm skin. This horse had carried him through Comanche territory when arrows whistled past his ears. She had found water in the desert when his canteen ran dry. She had stood guard while he slept under hostile stars, her ears always alert for danger. Comment below and let me know what state or country you're listening from. I love hearing how these stories of the Old West reach folks all around the world. The sound of cruel laughter drifted from the Silver Dollar Saloon across the street, where 5 men in expensive suits and polished boots stood watching Jake with the kind of predatory interest that made honest folks cross to the other side of the road. Their leader, a massive man called Bull Morrison, stood 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His black hair was slicked back with pomade, and his thick mustache failed to hide the cruel twist of his mouth. Gold teeth flashed when he smiled, and the pearl-handled Colt at his hip had seen more use than most men's working guns. "Your horse, there looks about ready for the glue factory, old-timer," Bull called out, his voice carrying the arrogant boom of a man accustomed to being heard and feared. His companions, a collection of hired guns and land grabbers who had been terrorizing small ranchers for months, chuckled appreciatively at their boss's wit. "Why don't you save yourself some trouble and sell her to me for $1? I'll put her out of her misery proper-like." Jake's hand stilled on Rosie's neck. The mare's ears flicked back at the hostile tone, and she took a half-step closer to her rider, sensing trouble the way horses always could. Jake had heard these kinds of words before, in 100 different towns from men who measured worth by the cruelty they could inflict on those they perceived as weak. His voice, when it came, carried the gravel of too many campfires and dusty trails. "She's not for sale at any price." Bull's eyes narrowed, and he stepped off the saloon porch with the deliberate swagger of a man who had never been told no by anyone he couldn't buy or intimidate. His boots struck the wooden planks with authority as his gang followed behind like jackals trailing a lion. "Everything's for sale, old man. Question is whether you're smart enough to take what I'm offering before I decide to just take what I want." The street had gone quiet now. Shopkeepers found urgent business inside their stores, and the few citizens who had been going about their daily business melted away like snow in spring sun. Even the dogs seemed to sense the electricity in the air and slunk into whatever shadows they could find. Jake stood perfectly still beside Rosie, one hand resting lightly on her bridle, the other hanging loose at his side near the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker. "I said she's not for sale," Jake repeated, his voice carrying no more heat than if he'd been commenting on the weather. But there was something in the flatness of his tone that made the youngest member of Bull's gang shift nervously and glance toward the nearest alley. Bull's face flushed red above his collar, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun before stopping. He wasn't quite drunk enough or quite stupid enough to draw on a man whose hands hung ready, even if that man did look old enough to be his grandfather. Instead, he pulled out a silver dollar and flipped it contemptuously onto the dirt at Jake's feet. "There's my offer, old fool. Take it or watch me take her anyway." The coin glinted in the dust like a piece of fallen sky, but Jake never looked down at it. His pale eyes remained fixed on Bull's face with the kind of steady attention that made lesser men remember urgent appointments elsewhere. Rosie shifted restlessly, picking up on the tension that crackled between the 2 men like heat lightning on a summer evening. Bull's patience, never his strong suit under the best circumstances, finally snapped like a dry branch. He drew his gun with practiced speed, the pearl handle catching sunlight as the barrel came level. But instead of pointing it at Jake, he turned the weapon toward Rosie's noble head. "Last chance, old man. Take my dollar or watch your nag die." The crack of the gunshot echoed off the buildings like thunder, sending every bird within a mile radius into panicked flight. Rosie crumpled to the dirt with a sound that would haunt Jake's dreams until his dying day, her beautiful head striking the ground with terrible finality. Blood, impossibly bright in the afternoon sun, began to pool beneath her still form. Jake dropped to his knees beside his fallen companion, his weathered hands trembling as he cradled her head in his lap. Rosie's dark eyes, already growing dim, found his face one last time. She tried to nicker, that soft sound of greeting she had made every morning for 15 years, but only managed a weak sigh before the light faded completely. For a long moment, the only sound in the street was Jake's ragged breathing and the distant creak of a windmill. Bull holstered his smoking gun with theatrical flair and bent to retrieve his dollar from the dust. "Well, old-timer, looks like you won't be needing this after all. Maybe next time you'll know better than to sass your betters." When Jake finally looked up from Rosie's still form, his pale eyes had gone the color of winter ice, and something indefinable had changed in the very air around him. Bull Morrison had just made the last mistake of his considerably violent life, though he was still too stupid and too drunk to realize it. The sun had barely begun its descent toward the western mountains when Jake Thornton started digging. He chose a spot on the hill overlooking Clearwater, where Rosie could watch the sunset she had loved so much during their evening rides. The rocky ground fought him with every shovelful, but Jake worked with methodical determination, his weathered hands blistering and bleeding as he carved out a resting place worthy of the finest horse that ever carried a man through hell and back. Word spread through the town like wildfire, and by evening a strange procession had formed on the hillside. Shopkeeper Murphy came first, his hat in his hands and genuine sorrow in his eyes. He had always saved the best apples for Rosie, and she had been gentle enough to take them from his young daughter's small fingers without even a hint of teeth. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house followed, carrying wildflowers she had picked from her carefully tended garden. Even old Doc Miller, who claimed to have no use for sentiment, stood quietly at the edge of the growing crowd. Jake worked through the night by lantern light, and when dawn broke over the eastern hills, he gently lowered Rosie's body into the earth with a care that spoke of 15 years of partnership. The townspeople watched in absolute silence as he covered her with dirt, then placed a simple wooden marker at the head of the grave. He had carved her name into the wood with his skinning knife, along with the words, "She kept me human." Meanwhile, the Silver Dollar Saloon rang with raucous laughter and the clink of whiskey glasses as Bull Morrison regaled his gang with increasingly embellished versions of the shooting. With each telling, old Jake became more pathetic, Rosie more worthless, and Bull's own courage more legendary. The five men had commandeered the largest table in the saloon, and their boots rested arrogantly on chair backs while they played poker with money taken from the ranchers they had been terrorizing. If you're enjoying this tale of loyalty and loss, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what country you're listening from. Trust me, what's coming will surprise you. Tommy Weiss, Bull's youngest gun hand, shuffled the cards with practiced ease while recounting how the old fool had actually cried over his dead nag. The boy was barely 20, with the kind of empty cruelty that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. Behind him sat Knife Eddie Garza, a Mexican gunfighter whose scarred face told the story of a dozen knife fights, and Dutch Peterson, a former cavalry deserter whose pale eyes held the flat emptiness of a man who had killed for pleasure rather than necessity. The strangest member of Bull's gang was Preacher Williams, a tall man in a black coat who still wore the collar of his former profession despite having abandoned any pretense of godliness years ago. He had been defrocked from 3 different churches for various sins of the flesh, and had found that his biblical knowledge served him well when it came to justifying the worst kinds of violence. His deep voice could quote scripture to rationalize any atrocity, and he had become Bull's favorite when it came to intimidating the more religious members of communities they terrorized. The saloon doors swung open with a creak that cut through the laughter like a blade, and Jake Thornton stepped into the smoky interior. The piano player's fingers stumbled on the keys before falling silent entirely, and conversations died mid-sentence as every head in the room turned toward the old cowboy. Jake had cleaned himself up after the burial, but his clothes still bore the dust of Rosie's grave, and his pale eyes swept the room with the kind of careful attention that made experienced men reach instinctively for their weapons. He walked slowly across the sawdust-covered floor, his boot heels striking the wooden planks with measured precision. The other patrons of the saloon melted away from his path like morning mist before the sun, finding urgent business at the bar or sudden interest in the faded paintings on the far wall. Jake stopped 3 feet from Bull's table, close enough to smell the whiskey on their breath and see the fear beginning to kindle in their eyes despite their bravado. "I need $50 for Rosie's burial," Jake said simply, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he had been discussing the weather. "A good horse deserves a proper marker and a preacher's words over her grave." Bull Morrison leaned back in his chair and let out a bark of laughter that sounded forced even to his own ears. "The old coot wants us to pay for his nag's funeral, boys. Maybe we should take up a collection for the poor fellow." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a handful of silver coins, then threw them contemptuously onto the sawdust at Jake's feet. "There's your 50 cents, grandfather. More than that crow bait was worth when she was breathing." The coins scattered across the floor with tiny metallic chimes, and several of the saloon's other patrons shifted nervously in their chairs. Young Deputy Sam Mitchell, who had been nursing a beer in the corner while trying to work up the courage to approach Bull's gang about the missing cattle, felt his blood run cold as he watched the scene unfold. Something about Jake's absolute stillness reminded him of stories his grandfather had told about legendary gunfighters, men whose names were whispered with equal parts respect and terror. "Pick up those coins and hand them to me proper," Jake said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made the hair on the back of Deputy Mitchell's neck stand up. The words carried no threat, no bluster, just a simple statement of what needed to happen next. Bull's face flushed red above his collar, and he lurched to his feet with the exaggerated movements of a man who had been drinking steadily for hours. His massive frame towered over Jake's seemingly frail form, and his hand dropped to rest on the pearl handle of his Colt. "The old fool wants respect, boys. Maybe we should teach him some manners the hard way." The sound of his open palm striking Jake's weathered cheek echoed through the suddenly silent saloon like a gunshot. Jake's head turned slightly with the blow, but he made no other movement. No sound of pain escaped his lips, and when he turned back to face Bull, his pale eyes had gone flat and cold as a January sky. Deputy Mitchell grabbed his partner's arm and leaned close to whisper urgently in his ear, "That's Jake Thornton, Billy. I'm sure of it. My granddad rode with him during the Apache Wars. They called him the Ghost of Red River because he could track a man across solid rock and kill him in the dark from 100 yards away." Deputy Billy Santos, a veteran lawman in his own right, took a closer look at the old cowboy and felt his stomach drop. He had heard the stories too, tales of a ranger who had single-handedly tracked down the Sanderson gang and left all 6 of them dead in a box canyon outside El Paso. A man who could read sign like other men read newspapers and who had never missed a shot when it counted. "Last chance to do right by Rosie," Jake said, and his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. But somehow every person in the saloon heard him clearly, and the temperature in the room seemed to fall by 20 degrees. The flatness in his tone carried more menace than all of Bull's shouting and posturing combined. Bull Morrison had built his reputation on being the biggest, meanest, most dangerous man in any room he entered. He had beaten smaller men to death with his bare hands and shot others down in the street without giving them a chance to defend themselves. But something about Jake's absolute calm was eating at the edges of his confidence like acid on metal. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto Jake's worn boots. "Tell you what, old man," Bull snarled, his voice loud enough to be heard in the next county. "Since you're so broken up about that worthless horse, I'm going to take your gun and your gear as payment for the entertainment you've provided. Consider it a tax for being stupid enough to cross Bull Morrison." Preacher Williams rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man who had survived more fights than he could count. His black coat fell open to reveal twin pearl-handled pistols worn high on his hips in the cavalry style, and his deep voice began to quote scripture with practiced ease. "Proverbs tells us that pride goes before destruction, old man, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Perhaps it's time you learned some humility in the face of your betters. Knife Eddie Garza remained seated, but his hand had dropped to the bone handle of the Arkansas toothpick that hung from his belt. The blade was 10 inches of razor-sharp steel, and he had used it to carve up more men than he could remember. His scarred face split into a grin that held no warmth as he contemplated adding another notch to his considerable reputation. Dutch Peterson and Tommy Weiss flanked out to either side of the table, their hands hovering near their guns with the practiced ease of men who had killed before and expected to kill again. The saloon had become a powder keg waiting for a spark, and every surviving patron pressed themselves against the walls or crept toward the doors, desperate to avoid being caught in the crossfire when violence finally erupted. Jake stood perfectly still in the center of it all, surrounded by 5 armed men who had killed dozens between them, and his pale eyes moved from face to face with the kind of careful assessment that a man made when he was calculating angles and distances and timing. Deputy Mitchell found himself holding his breath, waiting for the legend to reveal himself, while his partner reached for the scattergun behind the bar. The ghost of Red River had been backed into a corner, and everyone in the Silver Dollar Saloon was about to discover what happened when you killed the only thing that had kept a legend peaceful. Jake Thornton rose from his position with the deliberate slowness of a man who had all the time in the world, and something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The stooped shoulders that had suggested age and frailty straightened into the military bearing of a career soldier. The tremor that had seemed to affect his hands disappeared entirely, leaving fingers steady as stone. Most unsettling of all, his pale blue eyes went flat and cold as winter ice, taking on the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had looked death in the face so many times that they had become old acquaintances. Deputy Sam Mitchell felt the blood drain from his face as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Dear God," he whispered to his partner, barely loud enough to be heard over the sudden silence that had fallen across the room. "That's Jake Thornton. That's the ghost of Red River himself." The beer glass slipped from bartender Pat Murphy's nerveless fingers and shattered against the floor behind the bar, the crash echoing through the saloon like a gunshot. Murphy had been serving drinks in frontier towns for 30 years, and he had seen his share of hard men and legendary gunfighters. But he had never expected to see the most feared ranger in Texas history standing in his establishment, surrounded by 5 armed killers who had just made the mistake of their lives. "The Thornton," Murphy gasped, his Irish accent thickening with shock and terror. "Sweet Mary and Joseph, it's Jake Thornton himself, the man who rode with Captain McNeil and the Frontier Battalion." Jake's voice, when it finally came, had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly to every corner of the suddenly silent saloon. The words fell like stones into still water, each one precise and weighted with the authority of absolute truth. "Rode with them," he said simply. "Led them for the last 8 years of my service. Buried 43 men who thought my patience was weakness." Bull Morrison's face had gone from red to a sickly pale color, but his pride and the whiskey in his blood kept him from backing down even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run. "You're bluffing, old man," he said, but his voice had lost much of its earlier bluster. "Jake Thornton's been dead for years. Everyone knows that." Jake reached slowly into his vest pocket, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, and withdrew a tarnished silver badge in the shape of a 5-pointed star. The words Texas Rangers were etched around the edge, and in the center was the number 27. He held it up so that every man in the saloon could see it clearly, and the metal caught the lamplight like a fragment of fallen sky. "Never turned this in when I retired," Jake said quietly. "Captain McNeil told me I'd earned the right to keep it, seeing as how I'd filled more graves than any ranger in the history of the service." He pinned the badge to his shirt with steady fingers, and the simple action transformed him completely from harmless old cowboy to the most dangerous man any of them had ever encountered. Preacher Williams had gone white as his clerical collar, and his usually smooth voice cracked like a teenager's when he tried to speak. "That's not possible," he stammered. "The ghost of Red River disappeared after the Apache Wars. They say he went north to Montana and died in the winter of '78. Jake's pale eyes fixed on the false preacher with the kind of attention that made men confess sins they had forgotten they'd committed. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," he said with the ghost of a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. I went to Montana, that much is true. But dying was never part of my plan. He began to recite his credentials with the same matter-of-fact tone another man might use to discuss the weather. But each name he spoke hit the assembled killers like a physical blow. Comanche Jack Morrison, he said, and Bull's eyes widened as he realized the dead outlaw had been his own uncle. Shot him through the heart at 200 yards with a Sharp's buffalo rifle. The Sanderson brothers, all three of them faster on the draw than anyone here, left them dead in an arroyo outside Presidio when they made the mistake of kidnapping a schoolmarm. Tommy Weiss had begun to shake visibly, his boyish face contorting with the kind of terror that came from realizing you had awakened something that should have been left sleeping. He had heard the stories around campfires, tales of the ranger who could track a man across solid rock and kill him in complete darkness. Stories he had always assumed were exaggerated folklore designed to scare children and greenhorns. While Pete McGran thought he was fast, Jake continued relentlessly. Killed 18 men in fair fights before I caught up with him in Amarillo. He got his gun halfway out of leather before my bullet took him between the eyes. Knife Eddie Garza's scarred face had gone gray as old ashes, and his hand had moved well away from the Arkansas toothpick at his belt. Dutch Peterson, despite his reputation as a stone-cold killer, found himself taking an involuntary step backward as Jake's recitation continued. Black Hat Murphy and his gang, 7 of the meanest rustlers ever to cross the Red River. Tracked them for 2 weeks through country that would kill an Apache, and when I caught up with them, they were all faster with a gun than any of you boys. The transformation in Jake's physical presence was complete now. Gone was any pretense of age or weakness, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator in his prime. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but there was a terrible certainty in the way his right hand rested near the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker. The gun itself seemed different now, not just an old cowboy sidearm, but a tool of legendary precision that had ended more lives than most men could count. You killed the only thing that kept me peaceful, Jake said, and his voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. For 15 years, Rosie was my anchor to the civilized world. She reminded me that there were still good things worth protecting, gentle things that deserved to live without fear. His pale eyes swept across Bull's gang, cataloging their positions and weapons with the practiced assessment of a man who had survived more fights than they had ever seen. Now I remember why they called me the Reaper of Red River, he continued, and the temperature in the saloon seemed to drop another 10 degrees. I remember the weight of 43 graves I dug with my own hands. I remember the sound widows make when you bring them news that justice has finally caught up with their husband's killers. Bull Morrison's massive frame was trembling now, though whether from rage or fear was impossible to tell. His gang had begun to spread out instinctively, looking for angles and cover, but their movements seemed clumsy and obvious compared to Jake's supernatural stillness. The old cowboy stood in the center of their formation like the eye of a hurricane, calm and patient while chaos prepared to break loose around him. Deputy Mitchell grabbed his partner's arm and began backing toward the door, desperate to get clear before the violence erupted. Every instinct honed by years of law enforcement told him that he was about to witness something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The ghost of Red River had returned, and Bull Morrison's gang was about to discover why legends never truly die. The silence in the Silver Dollar Saloon stretched tight as a bowstring for 3 heartbeats before Bull Morrison's nerve finally broke. With a roar of rage and terror, he overturned the poker table and crashed through the saloon's front window in a shower of glass and splintered wood. His gang followed like startled cattle, stumbling over chairs and each other in their desperate rush to escape the pale-eyed specter that had materialized from their worst nightmares. Jake Thornton remained perfectly still as chaos erupted around him, his winter blue eyes tracking each man's movement with the detached interest of a hawk watching field mice scatter across an open meadow. He made no attempt to pursue them, showing no urgency whatsoever as boots thundered across the wooden sidewalk outside and panicked shouts echoed through the gathering dusk. Instead, he calmly retrieved the scattered coins from the sawdust floor, counting them methodically before placing them in his vest pocket. Deputy Mitchell and his partner pressed themselves against the wall as Jake walked past them toward the shattered window, his boot heels striking the floor with measured precision. The legendary ranger paused at the threshold and surveyed the street with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades hunting the most dangerous predators on the frontier. Bull's gang had scattered like quail flushed by a hunting dog, but Jake could read their panic in the trail they left behind. 50 yards down the street, Tommy Weiss stumbled and fell in his haste to reach his horse, scrambling to his feet with the graceless desperation of youth confronted by its own mortality. Preacher Williams had abandoned all pretense of dignity and was running full tilt toward the church at the far end of town, his black coat flapping behind him like the wings of a panicked crow. Knife Eddie Garza had disappeared into the maze of alleys between the buildings with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to urban warfare, while Dutch Peterson was already mounting his horse and spurring toward the edge of town. Jake stepped through the broken window frame and onto the sidewalk, glass crunching under his boots as he assessed the tactical situation with the cold professionalism that had made him legendary among the Texas Rangers. The town of Clearwater was laid out in a simple grid pattern with 3 main streets running north to south and 4 cross streets connecting them. There were perhaps a dozen buildings tall enough to provide useful vantage points for a sniper, and twice that many alleys and blind corners where a man could set up an ambush. Bull Morrison had commandeered a horse from the hitching rail outside the bank and was thundering toward the livery stable at the north end of town, his massive frame hunched low in the saddle as he lashed his mount with desperate fury. Jake watched him go with the detached interest of a chess master contemplating his opponent's opening gambit, already calculating 3 moves ahead. The ghost of Red River began his hunt with the methodical precision that had made him the most feared tracker in the Southwest. He started at the livery stable where Tommy Weiss had gone to ground among the horses and hay bales, thinking the familiar surroundings would provide some measure of security. The young gunfighter had pressed himself into the corner of an empty stall, his trembling hands clutching a nickel-plated pistol that looked more like a toy than a serious weapon. Jake entered the stable through the rear door, moving with the silent grace of smoke drifting on still air. His years tracking Apache war parties had taught him to become one with shadows and silence, and Tommy never heard him coming until a calloused hand clamped over his mouth from behind. The boy's eyes went wide with terror as he felt the razor-sharp edge of Jake's skinning knife pressing against his throat. "You're going to walk out of this town right now," Jake whispered in his ear, his voice carrying no more emotion than wind through dry grass. "You're going to keep riding until you reach Mexico, and you're never going to come back north of the Rio Grande. If I ever see your face again, I'll finish what your friends started here tonight." The knife blade traced a thin line across Tommy's throat, just deep enough to draw blood and drive home the seriousness of the threat. Jake released his grip, and the young gunfighter stumbled toward his horse, his legs shaking so violently he could barely stay upright. Within minutes, the sound of galloping hooves was fading into the distance as Tommy Weiss rode harder than he had ever ridden in his life, knowing that the ghost of Red River was watching every step of his retreat. 1 down, 4 to go, Jake murmured to himself as he examined the tactical situation. Dutch Peterson had made it to the edge of town, but had foolishly stopped at the old mining camp 2 miles north, thinking distance would provide safety. Preacher Williams had barricaded himself in the church, trusting in sanctuary that would prove as useless as his abandoned faith. Knife Eddie had taken refuge in the hotel, probably on the 2nd floor where he could watch the street and control the stairway. Jake's next target was the hotel, where Eddie Garza had indeed taken position in a corner room overlooking Main Street. The scarred gunfighter crouched beside the window with his Arkansas toothpick in one hand and a stolen shotgun in the other, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. He had survived this long by being smarter and more vicious than his opponents, and he was confident that his urban warfare experience would give him the advantage over an aging cowboy. The first sign that something was wrong came when Eddie caught movement in the mirror above the wash basin. For just an instant, he saw a pale-eyed face reflected in the glass before it vanished like morning mist. He spun around with the shotgun raised, but the room was empty except for shadows and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Sweat beaded on his scarred forehead as he tried to convince himself that nerves and imagination were playing tricks on him. The second sighting came from the mirror on the dresser across the room. Again, Jake's face appeared for barely a heartbeat before disappearing, this time seemingly from a completely different angle. Eddie fired the shotgun at the mirror, filling the room with thunder and flying glass. But when the echoes died away, he was still alone with nothing but his own terrified reflection staring back from the fragments. You can't hide from what's coming, Eddie. Jake's voice drifted through the broken window from somewhere in the darkness outside. I tracked Comanches through country that would kill a mountain goat, and they were better at hiding than you'll ever be. Eddie spun toward the window, his knife gleaming in the lamplight. But there was nothing to see except empty street and gathering night. The psychological warfare was working exactly as Jake had intended, fraying the gunfighter's nerves and forcing him into increasingly desperate mistakes. When the scarred killer finally broke and ran for the stairway, Jake was waiting in the shadows at the bottom with his own blade ready. The confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds. Eddie's reputation had been built on intimidating smaller men and cutting down opponents who were already wounded or distracted, but Jake Thornton had been killing more dangerous men than Eddie Garza when the scarred gunfighter was still in diapers. The Arkansas toothpick clattered uselessly across the hotel lobby as Eddie collapsed, clutching a throat that would never threaten another innocent soul. 2 down, 3 to go. Dutch Peterson lasted slightly longer than his companions, but his military training proved useless against an opponent who had written the book on frontier warfare. Jake tracked him to the abandoned mining camp and ended the pursuit with a single shot from 200 yards, demonstrating the marksmanship skills that had made him legendary among his ranger colleagues. Preacher Williams surrendered without a fight when Jake walked into the church and found him cowering behind the altar. The false minister babbled about sanctuary and divine protection, but Jake's pale eyes held no mercy for a man who had perverted faith into an excuse for cruelty. Williams joined his companions in the town cemetery before midnight, and Jake carved a simple message on his headstone. He preached evil and learned the truth. That left only Bull Morrison, who had made his final mistake by taking refuge in the Clearwater First National Bank. The massive outlaw had kicked down the door and was holding banker Henry Walsh and his teenage daughter Sarah at gunpoint, thinking that hostages would provide the protection his gun had failed to deliver. Jake stood in the middle of Main Street as the church clock struck midnight, his pale eyes fixed on the bank's barricaded entrance. The lamplight flickering in the bank's windows created a checkerboard of light and shadow across the street, and Jake could see Bull's silhouette moving nervously back and forth behind the glass. The outlaw was trapped and he knew it, but desperation had made him dangerous in an entirely different way. A man with nothing left to lose and innocent blood on his hands could do terrible damage before he finally fell. Jake began his final approach with the same methodical precision that had characterized the entire hunt. He had cut the telegraph lines an hour earlier, ensuring that no help could be summoned from the county seat. The roads leading out of town were blocked by fallen trees and carefully placed obstacles that would funnel any escape attempt directly into his waiting guns. Bull Morrison had painted himself into a corner, and now Jake was going to finish the job. "Come on out here, Bull," Jake called as he stopped 50 yards from the bank entrance. "You've got nowhere left to run, and we both know how this ends. Let the banker and his daughter walk away, and we'll settle this between us like men." The response came in Bull's voice, cracked with strain and whiskey courage. "You stay back, Thornton. I've got innocent people in here, and I'll kill them both if you come any closer. This little girl doesn't need to die for your revenge." Jake's expression never changed as he continued his steady advance, his boots striking the wooden sidewalk with measured precision. "This isn't about revenge, Bull. This is about justice for a good horse and an end to your reign of terror. Sarah Walsh doesn't deserve to die for your mistakes, but she will if you keep making the wrong choices." Bull's desperation peaked as Jake reached the bank steps, and the massive outlaw's voice rose to a near shriek. "I know what you're thinking, old man. You're thinking about that worthless nag I put down. Well, she's still dead, and she's still not worth dying for." Jake paused at the threshold, his hand resting lightly on the door handle, and when he spoke his voice carried the cold finality of winter wind through a cemetery. "She forgives you, Bull. Rosie had a gentle heart, and she never held grudges against anything, even the rattlesnakes that spooked her on the trail. But forgiveness and justice aren't the same thing, and I don't forgive as easily as she did." The ghost of Red River stepped through the doorway like death itself, and Bull Morrison realized too late that some legends were more terrifying than any nightmare his whiskey-soaked brain could have imagined. The standoff in the Clearwater First National Bank lasted until the first gray fingers of dawn crept over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose that reminded Jake of Rosie's coat when the morning light caught her just right. Bull Morrison had spent the night pacing back and forth behind the teller's cage like a caged animal, his massive frame casting grotesque shadows on the walls as he waved his pearl-handled Colt with increasingly erratic movements. Banker Henry Walsh sat perfectly still in a wooden chair with his arm around his daughter Sarah, a pretty girl of 16 whose dark eyes held the kind of terror that came from watching a man's sanity crumble in real time. Bull had been talking to himself for hours, alternating between grandiose boasts about his reputation and whimpering pleas to a god he had never bothered to acknowledge during his years of violence and intimidation. Jake had positioned himself just inside the bank's entrance, his back against the wall where he could watch both Bull and the street outside. The ghost of Red River had learned patience during his years tracking Apache war parties across the Chihuahuan Desert, and he was prepared to wait as long as necessary for the right moment to act. His pale eyes never left Bull's face, reading the outlaw's deteriorating mental state like a book written in a language only predators understood. As the sun climbed higher, Jake found his thoughts drifting to memories of the horse who had kept him anchored to humanity for 15 years. He remembered the morning he had first seen Rosie in a cavalry remount station outside San Antonio, standing apart from the other horses with her head held high and her intelligent eyes taking in everything around her. The sergeant had warned him that she was too spirited for an old campaigner, but Jake had recognized something special in the way she carried herself. Their first ride together had been a revelation. Rosie had responded to the lightest touch of his knees, anticipating his needs with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. During the Apache campaigns, she had carried him through country that would have killed a lesser horse, finding water where none existed and navigating treacherous mountain passes in complete darkness. She had stood guard while he slept, her ears constantly moving as she listened for dangers that human senses could never detect. The memory that haunted him most was the night they had been surrounded by Comanche war party 50 miles from the nearest fort. Jake had been wounded in the shoulder and barely conscious when Rosie had carried him through a running fight that lasted until dawn. She had galloped for 12 straight hours with warriors shooting arrows at her flanks, never faltering even when blood from her wounds darkened her beautiful coat. "Please," Bull whispered, his voice cracking like dry leather. "I've got money hidden. Enough to make you rich. We can split it 50-50 and you can ride away from here like none of this ever happened." The massive outlaw's face had gone gray as old ashes, and sweat poured down his cheeks despite the cool morning air. Jake's voice, when it came, held no more emotion than wind through winter branches. "Money can't buy back what you killed, Bull. Some things in this world are beyond price, beyond replacement. You shot down 15 years of partnership, 15 years of trust, and loyalty and love. No amount of gold can resurrect what you murdered in cold blood." The banker's daughter had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her young face as she realized she was trapped between two forces that were moving inexorably toward a violent conclusion. Her father held her closer, his own face etched with the kind of helpless terror that came from watching death circle like a hungry vulture. "I'll give you everything," Bull pleaded, his massive frame shaking like a man with fever. "Land deeds, cattle, the gold I took from those ranchers. Just let me walk away from this town, and you'll never see me again. I swear it on my mother's grave." Jake's pale eyes never wavered from Bull's face as he spoke the words that sealed the outlaw's fate. "Your mother's grave doesn't mean anything to a man who spits on other people's sacred things. You had your chance to walk away when I asked for $50 to bury Rosie proper. You chose violence instead of decency, and now you have to live with the consequences." The sun had climbed high enough now to send shafts of golden light through the bank's windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Jake could see the exact moment when Bull's last reserves of hope finally crumbled, leaving behind only the desperate fury of a cornered animal. The outlaw's grip on his gun tightened, and his bloodshot eyes took on the flat emptiness that meant killing was about to commence. "Let's finish this in the street," Jake said quietly. "Where Rosie died. where justice needs to be served. Let the girl and her father walk away, and we'll settle this like the men we used to be before you chose to become something less than human." Bull Morrison's laugh came out as a harsh bark that held no humor whatsoever. "You think I'm stupid enough to face you in a fair fight, old man? The ghost of Red River in his prime would have been suicide to challenge. And even at your age, you're more dangerous than anyone I've ever faced." "Fair doesn't matter anymore," Jake replied, and there was something in his tone that made the banker shiver despite the warming air. "You killed fair when you shot an innocent horse. You killed it when you terrorized decent folks who never did you any harm. All that's left now is the reckoning." The standoff might have continued for hours longer, but Sarah Walsh made the decision for all of them. The 16-year-old girl had inherited her father's courage along with his dark eyes, and she could no longer bear to be used as a shield by the man who had brought terror to her community. With a sudden movement that caught both men by surprise, she broke free from her father's protective embrace and ran toward the bank's entrance. Bull's reflexes, honed by years of violence, swung his gun toward the fleeing girl. It was the last mistake he would ever make, because Jake Thornton had been waiting for exactly this moment since the standoff began. His hand moved with speed that defied his apparent age, the Colt Peacemaker clearing leather in a draw so smooth it seemed choreographed by the angels themselves. The two gunshots came so close together they almost sounded like one, but Jake's bullet struck Bull's shoulder with surgical precision while the outlaw's shot went wild, shattering a window behind where Sarah had been standing. Bull's pearl-handled Colt spun from his nerveless fingers as he crashed backward into the teller's cage, his massive frame bringing down a shower of splinters and broken wood. Jake walked slowly across the bank floor, his smoking pistol held ready, but not quite aimed at the wounded man who lay gasping among the wreckage. Bull's eyes, no longer fierce but filled with the glazed look of a man confronting his own mortality, tracked the legendary gunfighter's approach with the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. "I didn't know who you were," Bull gasped, blood frothing on his lips as he struggled to speak. "If I'd known it was Jake Thornton, I never would have touched your horse. I swear it. I never would have hurt her if I'd known." Jake knelt beside the dying man, his weathered face showing no satisfaction in victory, only the weary sadness of a man who had seen too much death and dealt too much of it himself. "She would forgive you, Bull. Rosie had a gentle heart, gentler than mine. She never held grudges against anything that hurt her, not even the rattlesnakes that spooked her on mountain trails." The massive outlaw's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and his eyes had taken on the unfocused quality that meant his heart was beginning to fail under the stress of fear and blood loss. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Tell me she would have forgiven me. Tell me there's mercy for what I done." Jake's voice, when he answered, held the weight of absolute truth. "She forgives you, Bull. But forgiveness and justice aren't the same thing, and some debts can only be paid with blood. You took away the only thing that kept me peaceful, and now you have to face what that unleashed." Bull Morrison died not from his gunshot wound, but from the cardiac arrest that seized his massive frame as terror finally stopped his heart completely. His last breath escaped in a long sigh that seemed to carry away 15 years of cruelty and violence, leaving behind only an empty shell that had once housed something approaching a human soul. Jake sat in silence beside the body for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the awakening town outside. When he finally rose to his feet, it was with the slow movements of a man who felt every one of his 62 years weighing on his shoulders like a physical burden. He walked to the bank's entrance where Sarah Walsh and her father waited, their faces etched with gratitude and lingering shock. "It's finished," he told them simply. "Bull Morrison won't hurt anyone else, and his gang is scattered to the four winds. You can rebuild your lives without looking over your shoulders anymore." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity as the townspeople emerged from their hiding places to survey the aftermath of the night's violence. Jake supervised the burial of Bull and his gang in unmarked graves on the hill opposite from where Rosie lay, making sure that even in death the good and evil were kept separated by more than just distance. When the last shovelful of dirt had been thrown, Jake walked slowly back to Rosie's grave on the hillside overlooking town. He knelt beside the wooden marker and placed his hand on the earth that covered his faithful companion, feeling the sun warm his back as it climbed toward its noon zenith. "I kept my promise, girl," he whispered to the silent ground. "Justice has been served, and the men who hurt you won't hurt anyone else. But I wish you were here to remind me what comes after justice. What comes after the killing is done and the accounts are settled." Jake retrieved Rosie's saddle from the livery stable where it had hung and used since her death, running his scarred hands over the worn leather that had been shaped by 15 years of shared adventures. The silver conchos caught the sunlight as he carried it to the hill behind town, where he built a small fire and fed everything except the saddle itself to the flames. "No one else rides what was hers," he said aloud as he watched the smoke rise into the clear morning sky. "Some things are too sacred to be used by anyone else, too precious to be replaced or forgotten." The ghost of Red River stood alone on the hillside as the sun reached its zenith, casting his shadow across the town he had saved at the cost of his own carefully maintained peace. 3 months after the night Bull Morrison died in the Clearwater First National Bank, Jake Thornton had become something he never intended to be, the unofficial protector of a frontier town that had learned to sleep peacefully for the first time in years. The legend of the ghost of Red River had spread like wildfire across the territory, and every drifter with violence in his heart gave Clearwater a wide berth rather than risk facing the pale-eyed specter who guarded its streets. Jake had taken up residence in a small cabin on the hill near Rosie's grave, close enough to visit her marker every morning with the fresh apples he bought from Murphy's store. The daily ritual had become as natural as breathing, and the townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing the legendary gunfighter sitting quietly beside the wooden cross, talking in low tones to the horse who could no longer hear his voice. Deputy Sam Mitchell had worked up the courage to approach Jake on a warm September morning, his young face earnest with determination and hero worship. The boy had been practicing his draw every evening behind the jail, dreaming of the day he might be half as skilled as the man who had single-handedly ended Bull Morrison's reign of terror. "Mr. Thornton," Sam began nervously, his hat clutched in his trembling hands. "I was wondering if you might teach me some of what you know. About tracking, about reading men, about being fast enough to matter when it counts. I want to be a lawman worth the badge, sir, and I reckon there's no better teacher than the ghost of Red River himself." Jake's pale eyes studied the young deputy with the kind of careful attention he had once reserved for tracking sign across difficult ground. He saw the eagerness and idealism that reminded him painfully of his own youth, before 43 graves had taught him the true cost of justice served at gunpoint. "I'm not a teacher, son," Jake replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent walking the thin line between civilization and savagery. "I'm a warning about what happens when good men let violence become their only answer to the world's problems. You want to learn something useful? You ask Sheriff Davidson to teach you about keeping peace without killing. That's a skill worth having." Sam's face fell with disappointment, but he persisted with the stubborn courage that would serve him well in years to come. "But sir, you saved this whole town. You stopped evil men from hurting innocent folks. Surely that counts for something good in the eyes of the Almighty." Jake's expression softened slightly as he recognized the moral struggle that had plagued his own sleepless nights for more years than he cared to count. "It counts, boy. But every man I killed took a piece of my soul with him to whatever comes after this life. Rosie was the only thing that kept those pieces from falling away completely, and now she's gone. What's left of Jake Thornton isn't something you want to become." The conversation might have continued, but it was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hooves as 3 riders came galloping down Main Street with the kind of desperate haste that meant trouble was following close behind. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun as he recognized the signs of men running from something that had scared them worse than the law. The leader of the fleeing trio was a man Jake recognized from wanted posters as Scarface Riley, a cattle rustler and murderer who had been terrorizing ranches throughout the territory. Riley's companions were cut from the same cloth, hard-faced killers who lived by the gun and had never met a law they respected or an innocent they wouldn't harm for profit. Riley pulled his lathered horse to a stop outside the Silver Dollar Saloon and dismounted with the arrogant swagger of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted without asking permission. His scarred face split into a cruel grin as he surveyed the quiet town, seeing opportunity in the peaceful streets and prosperous-looking businesses. The town council had offered Jake the marshal position twice in the past month, but he had declined both times with the same quiet firmness he had used to refuse Deputy Mitchell's request for training. Now, as he watched Riley's gang spread out to terrorize the citizens of Clearwater, Jake felt the familiar coldness settling over his heart like winter frost on a window pane. The confrontation lasted less than 10 minutes. Jake walked down Main Street with the same measured pace he had used on the night Bull Morrison died, and Riley's gang made the same fatal mistake of underestimating the weathered cowboy, who didn't look like much of a threat. When the gunsmoke cleared, 3 more graves had been dug on Boot Hill, and Jake Thornton had added another dark chapter to his legend. That evening, Mayor Henderson and the town council approached Jake with a formal offer to become Clearwater's permanent marshal, complete with a badge, salary, and the authority to hire deputies of his own choosing. The mayor's weathered face was earnest with hope as he outlined the benefits the position would provide both for Jake and the community that had come to depend on his protection. Jake listened politely to the entire presentation before declining with the same quiet courtesy he had shown every other attempt to make him part of civilized society. "I appreciate the offer, Mayor, but I'm not the man for a badge and regular duties. What I am is a killer who's gotten too comfortable with killing, and that's not what this town needs wearing the star." As autumn deepened into winter, Jake found himself wrestling with thoughts that refused to be buried as easily as the men who had forced him to draw his gun. Rosie had been his anchor to everything decent and peaceful in the world, the living reminder that there were still things worth protecting rather than destroying. Without her gentle presence to guide him back from the edge, he could feel himself sliding inexorably toward becoming the very thing he had spent his career hunting. The crisis came on a cold December evening when Jake finally made the decision that had been building in his heart for months. He saddled the new horse he had bought from the livery, a steady bay gelding that would never inspire the kind of devotion Rosie had commanded, and loaded his few possessions into the saddlebags with mechanical efficiency. Jake rode slowly through the quiet streets of Clearwater as the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that reminded him of the colors in Rosie's mane when the light caught it just right. At the town limits, he stopped and dismounted, standing beside his horse as he gazed back at the community that had become something approaching home. The memory of Rosie's voice seemed to whisper in the evening wind, carrying words of wisdom that transcended the boundary between life and death. "You kept me human, girl," Jake said aloud to the gathering darkness. "Without you, I'm just another killer with a fast gun and a long list of graves to my credit. Maybe it's time to ride on before I become something this town should fear instead of trust." But as he prepared to mount his horse and ride away forever, Jake heard the sound of children playing in the distance, their laughter carrying across the prairie like church bells ringing out hope for tomorrow. He thought about Sarah Walsh, who no longer flinched when she walked past the bank where she had nearly died. He remembered the gratitude in her father's eyes and the way the townspeople had learned to sleep peacefully again. "One last ride, girl," Jake whispered to the memory of the horse who had saved his soul more times than he could count. "For both of us, one last ride to make sure the innocent stay safe and the guilty get what's coming to them." Jake Thornton turned his horse around and rode back into Clearwater as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. He had found his purpose again, not as the ghost of Red River, but as the guardian his beloved Rosie had always known him to be. If this tale of loyalty and justice moved you, like and subscribe for more stories of the Old West where honor meant something and some bonds transcend death itself. Some partnerships last forever, written not just in memory, but in the actions of those left behind to carry on the fight. The silhouette of horse and rider moved slowly down Main Street as Jake began his eternal vigil, forever watching over the town that Rosie's memory had taught him to protect.